No.
No.
Did we start?
He probably covers.
All right, guys. So today is lecture 6. So we're a little bit more than halfway through the course. Yay!
Wait, no, you're forgetting the extra week for the final.
Yeah. And so just a quick review of the first 5 weeks. The first week we did the introduction of the New Testament. If you guys remember, we went in detail about external and internal evidence. We talked about the Gospels, the book of Acts, the letters, the Catholic epistles, the revelations. We talked about how long the Old Testament took to be written. And then week 2, we covered the Gospels. We covered at a very high level what the Gospels are. And then week 3, we covered the book of Matthew. And week 5, we covered the book of Mark. And then we covered the book of Luke. And today we're going to cover the book of John. Okay? And just a quick recap. Matthew and Luke, they started with the physical birth, right? They were talking more about the birth of Christ. That's where they started. Mark focused straight on the ministry of Jesus as an adult, and then he went on from that. And we divided all the chapters, and we said what was talked about here, what was talked about there, right? Now, today we're covering the book of John, and we know that John was a witness. Okay, this is a very, very important point. He was a witness to all of this. He was a witness to even very specific things that other disciples didn't get to see. Okay? God chose him and few more that were almost at all the specific miracles or different things that he was one of the critical witnesses. So having his book is really important. And not only that, the book of John starts a little bit different because we said Matthew and Luke both focus from the physical birth, and then Mark focused from his adult ministry. John, if you look at John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. Okay? Right? So this is talking about all the way from the beginning. Do you guys understand? Completely different than the other 3. What did we call the other 3 Gospels? Synoptic Gospels. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. As we said, we're talking about Book of John. And so a few things here about John. The actual name is Yohanna or Yohanan, which is basically saying it means God the affectionate, or God the kind. Okay? Or God is gracious.
Bruh.
And we get to see that. Please have a seat. Okay, so we talked about God the kind or the affectionate, which is what the word means, or God is gracious. We said that he is also the son of Zebedee, right? So he has an older brother, and his brother's name is James. Some people call him James the Greater. And the reason why they call him James the Greater, his brother, is because there's another James who's James the Less, or James the son of Alphaeus. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. Okay? But, so, he has a brother. His name is James the Greater. They're both called the sons of Zebedee because their father's name was Zebedee. And they're from Bethsaida, Galilee. His father was a fisherman, and he was rich, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. And as I said, his name means God the kind, or God the affectionate, right? And we get to see that in a bunch of different miracles, or in a bunch of different conversations, like the Samaritan woman. We saw how kind God was to the Samaritan woman, right? Do you guys remember that? He went out of his way to go speak to her. And when he spoke to her, she was not talking to him in the most respectful way at first, but then she worked her way up, sir, master, and then she kept going and going to the point that she called him the Son of God, right? So he was very affectionate and kind and loving with her. Same with the blind man. Same with the sinful woman, right? So John focuses on God, the affectionate, or God that is gracious, God that loves. Okay? And his main purpose in the entire gospel is he wants people to believe in Jesus. He wants them to believe in Jesus Christ. He is not trying to tell the story of Christ. Okay? And if you guys look, when you look a little bit more into John, you're going to see that his book is the toughest one out of all 4 gospels. And that is very true. It's 21 chapters. And if you read the 21 chapters and you never read Matthew, Mark, or Luke, you're going to be very confused. Because he leaves a whole lot of information out on purpose. Because he doesn't want to waste time. He's like, Matthew, Mark, and Luke covered that. I'm going to cover other things. And he covered very specific things.
He was aware of the other 3 gospels while writing, but the other 3 didn't know. Like for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they
were writing at different places.
Yeah,
yes.
They didn't know the other people were writing it.
Yes, but John knew.
John had all 3.
John, yes, John knew what they were writing. Okay, so and we know that 80% of Mark is in Matthew, and we talked also about the divisions. If you guys remember from the Synoptic Gospels, what the percentages are, right, of how common they are. But John is different. And so there's a reason why it's the 4th. Remember, we talked about the first one being Matthew, and we said the reason that the first one was Matthew was because we are learning as we transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And Matthew, his purpose was to show the fulfillment of the Old Testament in the New Testament. So if you read it, you'll see that he talks about all the different Old Testament prophecies and how they are fulfilled in Christ. Okay? Now, John is the last one. He is the 4th. Who can tell me, or who can think of why? Kieran.
He's the last one alive.
He was the last one alive. That's good. But why in the arrangements is he the last one?
He was last one to write it.
I kind of gave you guys the answer already, huh?
Last one to write it.
Okay, but what else?
Wasn't it because he wasn't in sync with the other 3? He was kind of by himself.
He was by himself, yes. But I'm looking for something that I already said to you guys. His gospel is really difficult, right? And he leaves specific information out, and that's what I want you guys to keep that in mind, okay? So I'll share with you a few points. Like, for example, he assumes that we know a lot of information. Like the choosing of the 12 disciples. He assumes that we know that. So he doesn't talk much about it, okay? He assumes that we know a lot about the situation with John the Baptist, where he talks about, he says, he was not in jail yet. What do you mean he was not in jail? What happened? He was in jail? He never mentions it, right? He just talks about, this happened before he was in jail. Okay, so what happened, right? And this is the piece why I'm saying that this is a little bit more difficult, okay? And the other piece, which you guys kind of said, is he was the last one, and he started covering other things. And that's what I want you guys to start focusing on today. He focused on 3 different heresies, or actually maybe more. There's one, and we're going to talk about that here later. But he focused on Kenosis and Valentinos. Those 2 heresies were basically saying that Christ was not God, but he was just a temporary God. Like he was just temporarily there, right? But he wasn't God, right? So that was completely incorrect. We obviously know that's totally incorrect. And so he talks about that. And the dietism, he also talks about that. He's another heresy where basically the people were starting to say that he looks like human, but he's not truly a human. And it's like, wait, what? I was a witness, right? John, he said, I was a witness. I was there with him. And he goes and explains this, okay? Let's see, what else is on here? He was one of the 12 disciples. We already said that. His mother was Salome, and she was very, very God-fearing, okay? Another thing about John is that he was very, very quiet. He was on the quiet side. Compare Peter, for example, always talking, always has something to say, always has a response, right? But John was quiet. And that's why there's a verse actually, when Christ told John, behold your mother, and he told John, behold, he told him, behold your mother, and he told her, behold your son. They are very similar in personalities, where they were both more on the quiet side. And if you remember, John was the one that always wanted to rest his head on Christ's chest. That's it. He just wanted to rest his head. So he was quiet, and even in his writing, he doesn't really talk much about himself. He talks a lot about Peter. Okay? To the point that even he stayed with Saint Mary after Christ died. She stayed with him until she died. Okay? And then he started preaching in Asia Minor and Ephesus. Okay? And as we said, he was the last to write. He was also the disciple of Saint John the Baptist. Okay? That's really important information there. And the gospel was written to everybody. And we said already this was different than the Synoptic Gospels. He focuses on different things. And we'll talk about some of this stuff here in a second. Some of his nicknames, just so that I don't forget some of the information. His nicknames were John, son of Zebedee, John the Beloved. A lot of people get John the Beloved confused. They think that John the Beloved is John the Baptist. He's not. Okay? John the Beloved is John the disciple. Okay? And he was called the disciple whom Jesus loved. So the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's why they call him John the Beloved. Okay? And then also, he's also known as John the Evangelist, John the Theologian, John son of Thunder, and that was a name that was given to them by Christ. Okay? To him and his brother. They were named the Sons of Thunder. And remember, if we look at the dome, which one is John?
Eagle. Right?
Good job, eagle. Okay? And we talked about the eagle, which is a representation of the ascension, because John tries to take you up higher, and he tries to focus on the divinity of Christ. Okay? So we said, and again we said, from a personality perspective, he was the youngest one and last one to die. His brother was the first one to die. So James, his older brother, was the first one to die, and John was the last one to die. Okay? Let's see. We said that his father was a fisherman. In the book of Mark, he captures that his father had hired servants. That means he was rich. Okay? When someone has servants, that means they were rich. His mother, we said her name was Salome, and as we said, she is one of the women who followed Christ, and she even used her own money to serve Christ. Okay? And she was also, she followed Jesus to the cross with the other women, and she prepared spices and the perfumes. So she was one of those females that did that, and her life as an entirety was devoted to Christ, basically. To the point, if you guys remember, she's the one that asked Christ and said, take one of my sons on your right and take my other son on your left. And he told her what? What did he tell her? It is not for me, right? You guys remember this? Okay, so Salome was the mother of John and James, and when they were all sitting, she told Christ, I want you to keep one on your right. I'll just read it. To grant my sons to sit at your right hand and the other at the left in his kingdom. So she wanted them to basically sit at the right and left hand of, and this shows how she cared for the salvation of her kids, right? She was very focused on making sure that their spiritual life is, and that they have a joyful ending, right? An eternal ending with Christ. Okay. Origen calls it, that's misspelled, Origen calls it the crown of all the Gospels, and that's, as we talked about a lot of the things, I'm not going to repeat myself. He is not related to Jesus, okay? There's a verse in John 19. This verse, a lot of people get confused on, and they think that John the disciple, is related to Jesus, and he's not. So let me read the verse to you. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So when they see the word his mother's sister, they think that this is one person, and then Mary, the wife of Clopas, as another person. So they think that there's 4 people, but there's only 3, and they're talking about his mother, and his mother's sister, who is the wife of Columbus. So there was Mary, her sister, Saint Mary's sister's name was also Mary, and she was married to a guy whose name was Columbus, and they had a son. His name is James of Alphaeus, or James the Less. Okay, James the Less. That's why this James is called James the Greater. So people confuse the James, and they're like, oh, they're related, but they're not. Okay, I want to make sure you guys understand that piece. Because a lot of the kids do ask this kind of questions, so you guys need to understand these kind of things. Okay. Okay. Also, Saint John himself, in the first chapter, when he writes about how he meets Christ. So there is no reference here that they were connected by blood or anything like that. Okay. He was one of his first disciples, right? Where in the verse Mark talks about this. He says when he had gone out a little further from there, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother. Okay, so they were one of the first ones to be picked as disciples. Okay, let me summarize real quick. Yeah, so he spent, by the way, he spent his last days in Ephesus, where basically he wrote his gospel. He did not die crucified or anything like that. He was the only one. Okay. So what do I have on here? Okay. I want to capture something that I may not have had in the presentation here. Okay. Who knows what books he wrote? Which are the books that he wrote? St. John. Eh? Obviously.
John.
St. John. What else? Huh? Come on, guys. Revelation. Yes. And what else? Is that it? No, Acts is Luke.
Well, I know there's John 1, John 2, John 3, John.
Yes, first and second and third John. That's this John as well. Okay? Okay? So he wrote his book, St. John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelations. Okay? Clear?
Clear.
Okay. Alright. Now, before I jump into too much details on this, I want to summarize at a quick high level the 21 chapters, just so you guys know what we're talking about. Okay? Because as I said, it is much more difficult than the other three Gospels, right? So we know who the author is, right? And we know that the goal, as we said, the goal is that the people believe in Christ and to discredit any heresy, okay? And we talked about the three heresies. We're going to talk about them in a little bit detail. But for now, these are the two things. He wanted people to believe in Jesus, and he wanted to discredit the heresies. Okay, chapter 1 was a summary where basically he says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. And so basically he's saying that Jesus is God, and this is where Jesus calls his disciples. That's chapter 1. From chapter 2 to 12, he talks about 7 miracles. 7 miracles. The water turning into wine, healing the one official son, healing the paralytic man, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, healing the blind man, and raising Lazarus from the dead. Okay, these are 7 miracles, and we're going to talk a little bit also again later on why these 7 miracles specifically, and then later it focuses on kind of the glory of God and the kindness of God and his love in chapter 13 through 20, where basically Jesus starts comforting his disciples, right? He promises that he's going to help them, he prays for them, and then he dies for them. Okay, this is him showing his love and kindness. Basically, if you look at it, comforting, promising, praying, dying. Okay, and then he resurrects, and then the conclusion, which is the last chapter, chapter 21. After he dies, he visits 7 disciples. Okay, he visits 7 of them. I think it's in the Sea of Tiberias. If you guys read the book, the Sea of Tiberias, I believe. And then he feeds the disciples, and then he tells Peter to feed them. And he even asks Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? 3 times, right? And so that's kind of a quick, very high level of what the 21 chapters are in the book of John. Okay? Yes?
Do you know why he was so, do you know why he wrote a lot about Peter, why he was so close to him?
Yeah, so he focused on Peter a little bit more because Peter denied him. Do you remember that?
Christ?
Yeah.
Or John?
Peter. You said, why is he focused on
Why
Peter?
is John writing so much about Peter? Or why is it more about...
John was focused on everybody else, not himself. As I said, he was a quiet kind of guy, so he doesn't talk about himself. But he really focused on Peter. Okay?
Yeah, I'm at why.
Why?
Yeah.
He was for the majority of time he was with him.
Oh.
And he was capturing things that the other three did not capture. So there's a lot that happened. If you read example chapter 21, there's another chapter in there, I don't remember exactly which one, but he talks specifically to Peter to basically tell him that I forgave you, even though you denied me. Like, he wants to let him know that it's done, right? There is forgiveness. It's all about that love and the kindness that we're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Are you guys good with me so far? I don't know what time we're at or how we're doing on time.
You're at
Okay.
8.
I'm moving really slow. Okay. So evidence here. Again, this was written to everybody. And so here, as I said, the writing took in the place right before he died, which is in Ephesus. And so he didn't address those specific people because he was explaining the Greek meaning of some Hebrew words. So like where he said rabbi, which is to be translated teacher. So he's explaining, he's translating. Kind of like, who else did that? Do you guys remember? Matthew, right? We talked about that, the first one. Yeah. Which is say translated. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah who is called Christ, right? So he's explaining a lot about the Jewish traditions. It was written in the Greek language. He cared to mention a lot about Jesus' encounter with the Greeks, where, for example, the Jews said among themselves, where does he intend to go that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? You see how he kind of captured a lot about the Greeks as well. Now there was a certain Greeks among those who came up and worshipped at the feast. And then the word logos. Who knows what the word logos means? We say that word a lot. Huh? It's from ancient Greek philosophy.
Isn't it the Son of God? No?
It has a very specific meaning. It's one word. Means word. Sorry, no pun intended. But that's what it means. The word. The logos means the word. Okay? And that was basically his focus. The focus was to explain, if you guys read in the book of John, you'll see that he explains a lot about the Trinity. And he focuses on theology. And each verse that he has that's written in his book, basically each verse has different books by different early fathers that just explain how deep the meaning of what he was writing. Okay? So he was very deep into the theology. He was also not very quick to share like a story. Like if you go read the entire chapter of John 9, the entire chapter, he focuses on the man born blind. And he does that in 41 verses. It takes a long time to explain something, right? Like we talked about chapter 6, this is the only one where he talks about two different stories, but that was a very long chapter. He talks about feeding the 5,000 and walking on water. But for him to deliver the message, the final message, it took him a very long time to get to that. Huh.
I remember we were reading the story of the blind man a couple weeks ago,
yes,
like during the gospel, and like so many times I remember it was like the Pharisees going to ask the blind man what happened,
exactly,
and then they go ask someone else, and then they go back to him and be like, oh, how did this happen? And it would be the same thing over and over and over again.
Yes.
It was like for like 40 verses or like 38 verses, something like that.
Yep. Exactly. It was 41 verses. He basically builds up the story and takes his time, and then at the very end he delivers the message. But he takes his very sweet time. 41 verses. That's a lot. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the structure. So the structure of his writing is that he set everybody or set his writing in two different categories: believers and unbelievers. Okay? You were either a believer or an unbeliever. Versus the other gospels, they were talking about the people that were righteous versus the sinners, right? But John focuses on believers and unbelievers. Okay? And he basically says that the unbelievers, they lost the main condition to reach eternity. And I'll give you an example. In chapter 3, he says, He who believes in him is not condemned. But he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. Okay, another one. He who believes in the Son has everlasting life. And he who does not believe in the Son of God shall not see life. Okay? But the wrath of God abides on him. Another one. Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life. One more. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Okay? You see how he keeps talking about believes, hears, sees. Okay? So he focuses on a believer and a person who's not a believer. Okay? And as we see here, as we said, he's basically talking to everybody. We saw he's talking to Greeks, Hebrew, everybody. People from Ephesus, everything. Okay? Alright, we're going to get into the takeaways. You guys with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So, John, as I said, he was very unique in his testimony. Remember, he was a witness. Okay? So he was very unique in how he shared specific testimonies. So John himself was one out of the 3 disciples that Jesus chose. So he had Peter, James, and John in 3 different critical occasions. Who knows what they are? 3 different critical occasions. If you read and did the homework, what were they?
He said question and answer.
It's right there, the top one. John was one of the 3 disciples whom Jesus chose in 3 different critical occasions. What were they? And John was the one that spoke about it as a witness in detail.
Shoot, I forgot the name. What's it called? When he took him to the mountain and
Transfiguration.
Yes.
Okay, that's one. Anyone else? Come on, guys, who's doing the
I got my
homework?
one.
Wasn't it his
The raising of Jairus' daughter, raising of Jairus' daughter. Do you guys remember we talked about that last week?
Right.
From Luke's point of view, how, Jairus was like waiting for Christ to finish helping the lady that was bleeding for 12 years, right? And then they came and told him that your daughter is dead, right? Do you guys remember the story?
Yeah.
And then Christ goes, wait 1 second. He goes to Jairus' house, and then he chooses only 3 to go with him. Okay? And those were the 3 right there. Peter, James, and John. Yes, Mark.
Is the last one right before he got arrested when he took him to the mountain?
And the Garden of Gethsemane. Very good. Good job. Okay. So as we said, he chooses him, Peter, and James for specifically these different occasions. And then one other thing is, if you guys remember, John actually followed Christ all the way to the cross. Okay? He followed all the way to the cross, and he was with them under the cross too, right? Remember? Where he told Mary and John, behold, this is your son, and behold, this is your mother. He was so faithful to the point that he called Saint Mary his mother. And that's why some people confuse it and say that he's his brother, or that they're related, but they're not. Okay? There's a reason why he said that. It's not because they were brothers. We talked about that earlier, right? You guys remember that? Yes? Okay. When he told them, behold your mother and behold your son, it doesn't mean that they were related. It just means that he was so faithful to his master. Yes, Kiro.
So would him and Saint Luke be pretty close?
Huh?
Would him and Saint Luke be pretty close since Saint Luke spent a lot of time with Saint Mary?
I'm sure, yeah. I don't know the detail of it, but yes, I would assume so.
But they didn't reference each other much.
No, because again, John was not trying to capture what Luke captured, right? He knew what they were capturing, so he didn't want to repeat the message. He wanted to focus on other things. Okay. Let's see. So he was one of the 4 disciples. So Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they privately talked to Jesus about the end of times, right? You guys remember that? Yes?
What'd you say? Sorry.
Where he would talk to them specifically about the sign of times and the end of ages. And he asked John and Peter to prepare the Passover. And John was at the table of the Last Supper, and he was the one leaning on his chest. We just talked about that earlier. That's all he wanted to do, is just lean on his chest And he even asked him about the one that was betraying him. And John remained faithful to his master from the arrest and following all the way to the cross, right? One thing that you guys, just for awareness, is that John knew the high priests, and they knew him, okay? And he still followed him to the house of the high priest. So they could have accused him, they could have done something, but he still followed Jesus all the way into the courtyard of the high priests, okay? And then he even went out and spoke to one of them who basically kept the Torah and allowed Peter to come in as well, okay? All right, what else? He was the first to believe in resurrection. So if you guys remember, in the morning of the resurrection, Peter and John both ran together to the empty tomb, but John outran Peter. Okay, so John outran Peter, and he came to the tomb first. And if you guys remember, he stooped down and he looked and he saw the linen cloth lying there, but he didn't go in. And then when Simon Peter came,
isn't there different testimonies of that though? Like I don't think John wrote about himself when he wrote about going to the tomb.
all of them write about this. Yeah.
They all said that John and Peter were both there. Because I know some testimonies say it was just Mary Magdalene and then the teacher, then Jesus came, and others.
No, when Mary came and then she went and told them.
And they didn't go
And
either.
then they came.
No, I'm talking about before, like when they're going to the tomb.
Yeah.
Like they, so it's for sure.
Yeah, Mary, and then she told the two disciples, or she told the disciples, and then Peter and John together made their way to the empty tomb. And then John outran Peter completely. And then, but he didn't go in. And then when Peter came, they went in together. And then they saw the linen cloth, basically. And so John was one of the first people to believe in the resurrection. Okay? And then Christ himself shown himself also at the Sea of Tiberias. And John was one of the first ones to know him. Right? So that was where he said, "It is the Lord." Right? He is the first one that proclaimed and said, "It is the Lord." Let's see, what else? We see him twice with Simon Peter. Again, you say, why does he talk a lot about Simon Peter? It's because he's with Simon Peter a lot. His brother was one of he was the first disciple to be martyred, and John was the last one.
But he wasn't martyred.
Huh?
But John wasn't martyred, right?
No, only James, his brother. Okay?
How did John die?
John just died in that
John
room.
just died
That
in
he
Ephesus.
was basically in Ephesus, and he wrote his book. And
How old was
natural. James was martyred though. All of them were martyred except for John. Okay? Let's see. I'm trying to skip through a bunch of information here just for the sake of making sure we capture everything. Okay, so we talked, I'm not going to go into too much details here, but we talked about, this is more on theological depth, which I'm not going to go too much in. I'm going to send you guys these notes. But one of the things that I will talk about is when how many sacraments do we have in a church?
7?
Everyone thinks it's 7?
Oh no, it's not 7.
It is 7. I'm
it
just
is.
making sure. I'm just making sure. I'm not seeing everybody.
He's like, does anyone think it's 7?
Okay, yes. So there is 7 sacraments. And you'll find all these 7 sacraments in the book of John. For example, the first chapter talks about baptism. Baptism of Christ. And then the conversation with Nicodemus. And then the man born blind. All these reference baptism. Okay? The Eucharist. The Eucharist is in chapter 6. So there's an entire explanation. This is my body, which is indeed given for you. And we say this in the liturgy, right? And this is my blood. My blood is drink indeed. That's when the people walked out on him and they're like, are you crazy? Like, you're telling me that this is actual food and this is actual blood? I'm not a monster. I'm not going to have this. And people walked away. But he was truly speaking about this. We talked about this like a few weeks back. I'm not going to repeat the entire story. So that's baptism and Eucharist. And then there's the confession and repentance. That's in John 8. So John 8 captures confession and repentance. So we know the Samaritan woman and the sinful woman. There's more examples. But in chapter 8, it captures confession and repentance. And then also priesthood is covered in John 20, where in absolution, Abuna will say, those whom you bound, do you guys know what I'm talking about? whatever is bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and so on. That is one of the prayers that the priests do, and that is in John 20. Okay? The weddings, right? That's in Canon of Galilee. That's also in the book of John.
That exact prayer is in St. John?
Yeah, those whom you bound will be bound on earth. And
Okay.
yep. And then he also talks about the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, right? That's in like 4 different chapters, from 13 to 17. Okay? And he talks about God's Spirit in detail. And he's one of the main ones that focuses on that. Okay, so again, he explains the divinity of Christ as being the eternal Jesus Christ. He tries to explain the distinction between the Son hypostasis and the Father hypostasis, the unity between the Father and the Son, and then Christ the Creator and the exclusive sonship to the Father. Okay? Again, it's all about the divinity. Remember, he is just trying to explain, he's trying to present the divinity of Christ. And he is a witness of the divinity of Christ. Okay? And he records a lot of his testimonies, the things that he sees. And in his chapter 17, it says, "And this is the eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you sent." Okay? So he's revealing the Trinity, his divinity, and the relationship to the Father and the world through Jesus Christ. Okay? All right. Let me keep moving forward for the sake of time. All right. This is another important one. Basically, it's another takeaway where in the book of John, he says, "I am" a lot. Okay? I or I am. And again, this is the focus on the divinity of Christ. Basically, how Christ and only Christ is the only one that can satisfy any of our needs. Okay? And so you'll see that it says, "I am the bread of life." So he's satisfying our needs, but also on the cross. So our needs is spiritual food, but on the cross, breaking the bread. Okay? "I am the light of the world." He is basically saying that there is darkness in the world, but he is enlightening our darkness. Okay? Light is against the darkness. We saw that on the cross. These are the things that we saw on the cross. He says, "I am the door of the sheep." So he is sheltering us, basically. We know that we're strangers in this world, so he's sheltering us. And then on the cross, he was the door in which life was found, right? He descended into Hades through the cross, right? Abuna does this and kisses the altar when he says he descended into Hades. He's trying to show you, like, physically a symbol. So, let's see the next one. "I am the resurrection and the life." So we know that in him we defeated death and we gained life. And then also on the cross, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain." Do you guys understand this? Yes? Anybody wants to elaborate? Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. So you can't leave a grain up alone. It has to fall down and die, and then it will produce much grain. That's exactly what happened with Christ. He had to die, and then he saved us. He gave us resurrection and life. Okay? "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So he is the only way that we can have salvation. So he is the way to get us into salvation. And then on the cross, the way that stepped us over from darkness into light, or into heaven, right? Even when you go in the church, there is a satara or a curtain in the middle that separates the earth and heaven, right? You have earth and heaven. And when Abuna opens it, and when Abuna opens the satara or the curtain, he has to hold the cross in his hand. He has to. Because that's the only way that you can separate heaven and earth, is through the cross. So next time when Abuna opens the curtain and says, "Alaysoni ma sosioso batir uban tukratur," and he opens it, he's holding the cross in his hand. He never does it
even when he closes it.
Any time. He's always holding when he is on the curtain, he's holding the cross. Okay?
But why would he have
When
to-
he's opening.
Okay, that's what it was.
When he's opening. Because he's separating heaven and earth. Okay? Good? Keep going. I'm trying to give you guys practical
Yeah.
examples from the liturgy to make this a little bit more related. Okay, I am the true vine. So he unites us with him. We become, if you guys read this, where we say that Christ is the vine and we're the branches, right? If you think about it, you as a servant, when you serve all kinds of kids or whatever, even if you're serving your peers who are other servants, and let's say you got into a fight with one of them, or something went wrong, or someone upset you, or made you feel bad, or whatever it is. If you don't understand this, you're gonna fall into problems. If you don't understand where he says, I am the vine and you are the branches, basically, the vine is the one that holds the branches. If you're expecting another branch to help you, this is the problem. You're not holding on the vine. The vine is the big, tree, right? The actual, that's where the water comes from too. So the water is the gain, right? The gain that we all get through the Eucharist, through the Gospels, through our readings, through everything through the fasting and praying. That's where we get that relenchment, or whatever the word is, right? We get that refreshment, or we get the food, our spiritual food. We get it from the vine, because we're just a branch, right? And the more that you consume from that, the more your branch starts getting stronger, and then you can produce fruit as a servant, and basically, work with all the kids, or even influence people around you, even if you're not serving with them. Okay? So this one is very critical. I hope you guys understand this, because I see people a lot get upset and then they say, I'm out. This is not how you should be doing service at all. That means you are serving for the wrong purpose. Okay? You're serving with the power of the vine, Christ. He is the one that's giving you support. You don't have to lean on anybody. Doesn't matter. Focus on your relationship with God. And anytime you give a lesson, or anytime you do this stuff, you should be growing. If you're just copying information from a previous presentation, you're not helping yourself and you're not helping the kids. Because that means you're just reading off some stuff and you don't actually try to do the research or the analysis to make sure that you actually understand what you're saying. You need to take it to that next level. Because if you don't, your kids will not know it. So does that make sense? From a leadership perspective, there is a book called The Laws of Leadership, and there is one law called the law of lid. I'm steering away here, but just bring you guys back. There is a law called the law of lid. Has anybody heard of it? The law of the lid says that you as a leader, whatever you know, that's all that everyone under that lid knows. As you grow your lid, as you grow your information, that lid opens up, and the people that are with you know more. Does that make sense? So whatever you teach your kids, that's all they know. Does that make sense? It's a simple equation. Okay, let's get back to this. Also, I who speak, I'm he. So he says this to the Samaritan woman. I, remember I said, he says I or I am. Here he says, I who speak, I'm he. And yeah, okay. So these are different examples of I am. Okay, which again focuses on the divinity of Christ. Okay, focuses specifically on the divinity of Christ, how Christ and only Christ is the one that can satisfy our needs through the cross, and then all the other needs that we have. Okay, okay. So remember, we did this with all the other books, kind of talking about the objective of the gospel. And each time I gave you guys 3. So same thing here. So one is complementary, which I've been kind of talking about. The other one is educational, theological, and practical. And then the last one is defensive, which is from the heresies perspective. Okay, so the first one, complementary, as in, as I said, he doesn't capture things, or he tries to avoid duplicating information. So for example, he mentions nothing about choosing the 12. But in chapter 6, he says this, just so you guys can see how it's much tougher than if you read the other 3 books. He says, did I not choose you the 12, and one of you is the devil? إيه ده؟ يعني اللي هو you're reading this and you're like, whoa, he chose 12 and one of them is the devil? I don't know what you're talking about. So if you haven't read the other 3 Gospels, where one of them says, here's the 12, blah, 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 and he says all the names. And then he explains and goes through the stories, right? But this one, chapter 6, he just goes, did I not choose you the 12? And one of you is the devil. He assumes that you know some information. And then even, as I said, the imprisonment of John the Baptist, so he assumes that the reader knows that John the Baptist was thrown into the prison. So in chapter 3 he says, for John had not yet been thrown into the prison. We just talked about this earlier, right? Like, how do we know that he was thrown in prison? Like, we had no idea. So he leaves out also the birth of Christ. His baptism he lightly touches. And then the temptation on the mount, again, all these and almost all the miracles that were talked about by the other evangelists, except for those 7 miracles that I brought up in the beginning. If you guys remember, feeding the 5,000, walking on water. Also, John touched on, he also touched on the Last Supper, the Passion in Gethsemane, and the resurrection. Okay? So, this is what I mean by complementary. He leaves some of the things that the other evangelists wrote, but he also he mentions what was left out by them. Okay? So, for example, in the miracle of the 5,000, right? In the miracle of the 5,000, Matthew and Mark, they point this out. They say basically that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. Okay? Now John, he comments in chapter 6, verse 15. He says, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Okay? Do you see the difference? One of them says that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. So he told them, leave, go before me. And he sent the multitudes away. John says they were about to come and take him. The people were about to come and take him by force and make him king. But he departed alone. And he departed to the mountain alone. So he told the disciples, go, right? He told them, go to the other side. And he sent the multitude away. Here it explains a little bit more detail that we did not know from Mark or Matthew, because they're the two that talked about this miracle. Okay. Another one was the woman who poured the fragrant oil, right? So in this one, Matthew and Mark, they just point out that the woman approached Jesus and that she poured fragrant oil on his head. But John mentions this. He mentions that the woman was Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and he adds that she anointed the feet of Jesus without mentioning that she poured the oil on her head, considering that would be a known matter. Okay?
Didn't he also talk about Martha?
Huh?
Didn't he also talk about Martha?
Yes. But the point is that he mentioned who the woman was because they left that out. They just said a woman approached Jesus and she put oil on his and poured the fragrant oil on his head. And John, speaks more and says who she is. He says that she's Mary, the sister of Lazarus. And he doesn't mention the oil part because they captured that. Okay? So that's what we mean by complementary. And then Ephesius of Caesarea, he's one of the early fathers. He basically doubles down on that message. Okay? All right. Let's see. I have more examples, but I might skip them because we're running out of time. Let's see, the educational, theological, and practical. Here is a verse right there. But these are written to you that you may believe Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This, if you didn't get anything out of what I said, anything today, get this verse. Okay? This was the main message that John was trying to deliver, is that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, and by believing you may have life. And life is resurrection, which means you're a believer. And he was trying to prove that Christ is the Messiah, the eternal Word, and he's God himself. Because there was a lot of heresies, which is the defensive piece down here, where he had to defend Christianity against all the heresies that were happening during that first century. And we talked about a bunch of them. There is basically they were the Gnostics, and we talked about what they meant. Some said that he didn't have a physical body. Some denied the divinity of Christ. and they misunderstood the manifestation. So these are the different things. These are the different heresies, and I list them down here basically. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay. That's all I had. I skipped a bunch of things, but just for the sake of time. Okay. Yeah, let's stop here. Okay.